Namaskar. Welcome to the 13th episode of Satya Samvad. Bharat underwent colonization on multiple fronts at the hands of successive imperialist powers, political and economic primarily, but also on the intellectual front. A major way that this was effectuated was using the two-pronged approach. Firstly, by demolishing indigenous Bharatiya institutions of wisdom and education, such as Nalanda and Vikramshila, and secondly, promoting foreign values and ideas as a foundation of quote-unquote progressive education models, such as done by the likes of Macaulay. In an increasingly polarized world, the comprehensiveness and cosmopolitanism of Bharatiya knowledge generation and dissemination may just be the need of the hour, with a vision for the future rooted in the civilizational heritage of Bharat. Why then are our youth ashamed of their identity and pride in their cultural value? Should we not do more to highlight and promote these said values? To discuss all this and more, we have with us today Dr. Archana Purushottam ji. We welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on your channel.
So Dr. Archana Purushottam is a MD and PhD, and she is a neurologist and neuroscience researcher, educated at the JIPMER, IIT Bombay, and Stanford University. She is currently on the faculty of the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, in the US. She is deeply interested in Ayurveda and yoga and conducts research into how best to integrate them with the modern medical paradigm. She's interested in also reviving traditional Bharatiya education and understanding its effect on the brain and psyche of the students. So, ma'am, Bharat has had a flourishing culture of knowledge generation and education over millennia. From the time of the Rig Veda onwards, our ancient education system evolved over the period and focused on holistic development of the individual by taking care of both the inner and the outer self. The system focused on the moral, physical, spiritual, and intellectual aspects of life. Sources of learning were drawn from various disciplines such as Itihas, history, Anvikshiki, which is logic, Mimamsa, interpretation, Shilpa Shastra, which is architecture, and Artha Shastra, which is polity or political economy, if you will. Indigenous education was imparted at home, in temples, pathshalas, tolls, chatushpadis, and gurukuls. Today, we may have modern education, so to say, but have lost out on many of the more nuanced aspects of Bharatiya Shiksha Pranali, the Indian educational framework. Can you tell us a little about this and how you are working to decolonize education with reference to your Agastya Gurukulam?
Sure. So, you already summarized that very well. The traditional Bharatiya Shiksha Pranali or Paddhati was a very holistic kind of education. And, nowadays, the word holistic education and holistic development is bandied about. We hear about it all the time without it being really holistic in many ways. But that was a truly holistic kind of education. And some part of it, a subsection of the students lived in the guru's place. So the Gurukul system that we have heard about, right? It was the residential. Of course, that was the complete all-round development where the guru took care of everything. 24 hours a day they were under his and the Guru Matas. The Guru Mata was no less. She was equally important because she had several values and other things to teach them. So that was a subset of students. But there was a very large section of the populace of the students who were actually taught in the what are called the smaller pathshalas. In fact, in Tamil, there's a term which is called like a veranda school, right? Basically, what this means is, in every few streets, you would have one house where there would be a teacher. So this was the teacher's house. The children didn't live there. They came from the surrounding neighborhood, but it was a day school. They would come there, learn, and go back to their homes. And typically this happened on the veranda, in front of the house. So that's why they were called these veranda schools. But there was an extensive system. So starting from this very sort of local, informal veranda schools, all the way to Nalanda and Takshashila that you were talking about, there was a very intricate network of institutions of learning at different levels. And this catered to the entire population. So it was not only meant for those who were going into classical learning, right? Who were learning the Shastric texts. No, it was meant. So in fact, a large, there is Dharampalji's book. If we look at what he has said after looking at the British survey of education, the status of education in India, you can see that a very large number of students came from the non-Pandit pathway. They were people who were from the merchant class. There were people who were from the farmers. So the education was tailored to meet all these different needs according to the students that that teacher had. So that was the true holistic education. I think the education that it was reduced to by the British when they changed our system, and what we still have currently, and we are trying to make it more holistic. But what we have essentially is learning facts, learning information. Okay, that can tell you how to do things, right? If someone tells me, okay, we need to build a bridge, right? The maths, the material science, all that teaches you how it should be done. But what we are missing really is what needs to be done, right? To understand that, to come up with plans for the betterment of society, I don't think students are being equipped sufficiently for that. So what we are trying to do here in Agastya Gurukulam is to revive that, where you not only give students the tools to achieve certain goals, but also the ability to create a vision to set those goals for themselves and for the community as a group. So that is a major thing that we want to do.
Absolutely. So, I mean, immersive education, truly immersive education, and one that is experiential, of course. I was just wondering because, having previously worked on a certain project with the National Education Policy, there was a comparative study between the education models of different countries. And Belgium happens to have a very interesting kind of model of tracking and, developing or nurturing, different competencies, different tracks, so to say. I was just wondering, because you mentioned about the specialized or customized kind of education for different kinds of students. Could you please tell us a little about how you assess, how do you kind of work with the students along the journey of their education?
Yeah, at this time in Agastya, we have a schooling that goes from K to 8, and we are using a certain curriculum, a basic curriculum, because in the K to 8, in the modern day, it would seem to us that most of the the basic subjects need to be taught. All said and done, they still need to go back to the regular world. So if, for instance, if they're going back to high school or to college, they need to have met those minimum requirements. So there is the customization we can do is limited from that perspective. That's why we're still at the primary and middle school level. Greater customization can be done as they get into high school, where you can start learning certain things in depth. But right. Even as we are right now, there are elective subjects, right? So for instance, we have art, that is painting, drawing, that kind of art. We have music, we have Kalaripayattu, that's the martial art form of Kerala. So several of these offerings, in addition to the basic core curriculum, those are depending on the students' interests and abilities. But within our core curriculum, we are able to customize it to the extent of, we want the student to be challenged, but not find it too tough. So we actually, because it also helps us that our numbers are not huge. If we were running a school for 1,000 kids, this would be tough to do. But with a smaller number, we are able very much to adjust the grade level to their level of achievement. So for instance, if a child is doing extremely well at their grade level, and therefore in mathematics, say, and it's appropriate for them, they're no longer being challenged at the grade level. So it's appropriate for them to move to the next level. So we are able to customize the timetable so that that child for maths alone is able to sit in the higher class. And for the other subjects where he or she's at grade level, they can come back to their class. Sometimes the child is doing so well in all subjects that they may actually be able to move ahead. So there are many of our children who are doing maths or science or what, you can pick, or Sanskrit, or, specific subjects ahead of their grade level because they've gone ahead. We similarly can allow for children who are, for instance, who join us late, meaning, they have not come to us at first standard level. They have come to us at fifth level. So their Sanskrit is not yet up to our fifth grade curriculum, right? Because it's a new subject to them. They weren't learning Sanskrit. So then we are able to make allowance for them to, for instance, take class with the third graders so that they can catch up and, eventually move up to their grade level. So that kind of customization we are able to do. Going further into different fields, I think that really will happen at the high school level. We are hoping that we will be able to expand once we have our primary and middle school. We're working on some parts of the curriculum for that right now. But once that is well established, we would like to expand into high school. And that's where a lot more customization can be done. Besides, the children also early on, they may not really know what they want to do, right? They start getting an idea of what they may like only as they get to those classes.
Great. And we spoke about the curriculum itself. Have you also been looking into the differentiated curriculum mode of things? I mean, where one looks at the different tendencies, the capabilities, and the tracks, that help or optimize the learning experience of different students. So, for instance, I think there are some technological, dashboards, I believe, at the moment, which do look at differentiated curriculum. So, just a curiosity there. Have you also been looking into that direction?
We don't have a technological dashboard that we use, but we do, because this is a very, again, as I said, we are a small group. Our teachers are able to assess and individualize to a certain extent. So yes, we do have that. Plus, we have, different ways of learning. There are children who learn better by ear, auditory learners. So we give them, for instance, records of chantings or refer them to it to listen and to learn. On the other hand, there are others who are visual learners. There are others who actually are hands-on learners. So we bring in hands-on activities also. So we use a variety of these techniques, which I think in the modern educational pedagogy, a lot of schools are trying to do that. But yes, we definitely do that with our children.
And when we talk about education itself, there is, of course, this idea of pacing of the course with regards to, of course, the student, learning experience, but also the autonomy of teachers. When we talk about the ancient Gurukul system, teachers had a certain degree of autonomy in the various aspects, from selection of students, of course, to designing the syllabi. When the teacher was satisfied with the performance of the students, the course concluded to some extent. Today, when we talk about new age pedagogical practices, when we talk about, of course, just now we spoke of differential, curriculum, but of course the student pacing of sorts when it comes to the learning experience, tailoring courses, looking at the students' interests. Have you not spoken about this long back? I mean, so to say.
Yes, and this is the same story, right? Things that were really ancient practices that have traditionally used to be followed. In some cases, they're still continuing. In some cases, those practices have actually been abandoned as unworthy. Now are being polished, rebranded with a different name, and then brought up as, the hot new things coming to us from the West. So, whether this happens in education, whether this happens in, yoga, for instance, right? Yoga is a very ancient system. And now yoga, if one wants to hire, for instance, here, a yoga instructor, right? They have to be certified by a Western body. Somebody who's trained, in yoga in India, in the best yoga university of India, would not be eligible to take up certain, take up these positions of yoga instructor or yoga therapist in hospitals or other schools, etc. Because it becomes something that others own. And now the same thing has happened again. I'm in medicine, so there are several examples there also. Mindfulness is now such a big thing. You hear the word mindfulness, you would never realize that it actually comes from our Vedic traditions. The Vedic meditation, Vipassana, these are the origins of where this whole mindfulness came from. But you don't hear that connection at all. So the same thing in education also, you can see is very true. In fact, when the British colonized India, right, the literacy rate in India was recorded as 50%, right? This covered, I think, some of the big presidencies, Madras, Punjab, Bombay, and it was recorded to be at 50%. The literacy at the same time in England was 33%. It was approximately 1/3. So we were more literate than they were when we were colonized. But because this system of education was destroyed, but before destroying it, they studied it, they learned the principles of this education, they took it back and introduced it in their system of education so that they could get more of their population educated, and then they destroyed what we had. So this has been the story that has repeated itself over and over about our traditional practices turning out to be very, very valuable in many fields.
Absolutely. I think the aspect of appropriation, of course, and how it has been kind of used in different contexts, which brings me to the next kind of point of discussion, which is actually two-pronged in itself. One is that of the uncontextual, or not, the lack of context when it comes to many of these practices. You mentioned about yoga, for instance, and I do remember that while being at Cambridge, for instance, there was a certain aspect of deracination or decontextualization of the practice, so to say, because it of course belongs to a much broader kind of stream of understanding of practices, essentially, but it was only reduced to a set of exercises, for instance, and certain populist kind of ways of doing things. And it's not only true for yoga, but even various other kind of Indian knowledge systems, so to say. Being in Nyaya Vaisheshik, for instance, in Mimamsa, there are many such places where it has been just picked. Some aspects have been picked and not in the right context, so to say. So how do you see us kind of working against this, fighting this, and not kind of going with this direction of doing things?
Yeah, the first thing is really to create awareness, right? And that is what Agastya seeks to do. We want our next generation to be aware of what these treasures are, these Indian knowledge systems. So, you have to, these impressions are formed very young, actually, right? What happens with a lot of us, we were brought up, thinking that the Western was always superior to ours. Their knowledge systems were better. Their ways of doing things were better. This was, not told to us in so many words, but, unconsciously, this was what was fed through the education system, as well as it became the narrative around us. So we really need to change that. Our children need to be aware of how prescient and how ahead of their times our knowledge systems were. And it's a funny thing to say ahead of their times, because we're talking relative times of two different places, really, two different civilizations, two different cultures. So this is what our children want when they study in Agastya. And now there are many other organizations also running such education systems. So, that I believe we all need to do this, is to first start with educating our youngsters. And if they start learning, and this is where Sanskritam is very important, because a lot of this knowledge is in the medium of Sanskritam. And how much ever you translate, right, you cannot get the full original flavor. And you are at the mercy of those who translate with a specific motive, right? This has happened all through. Western scholars have translated our texts without a genuine understanding, or maybe with a mischievous intent, even if they understood it, to present it in a different way, right? This has happened all the time. And now when people who don't understand Sanskritam at all, they read that, obviously they are looking at everything through the westernized lens, through the colonized lens. And so when that lens is meant to diminish the achievements of the indigenous civilization, naturally you have youth who are ashamed of their Indian roots, of India's backwardness, etc. So once you actually are able to read, understand the original to a certain extent, there is nothing can convince you otherwise that this is backward and this is doesn't stand the test of Western science and knowledge. And so that is really the first thing to do, to give our children the tools to assess this on their own, to make these judgments for themselves. Once they've actually studied these systems, the Bharatiya knowledge systems, it becomes apparent the kind of depth and richness that is there in each one. It's just astounding. And then you compare it to what is taught in Western education. You learn that it's a very sort of, shall we say, a very easier, a more superficial subset of this that is taught. So that is something people can experience. We also do a co-schooling program besides our full-time schooling. And that is for children, not all can study with us, obviously. So people who are in, children who are in other schools, we have a co-schooling program to teach them after hours. So, after school, evening, weekend hours, where we're able to give them, this insight into our culture, the richness and its knowledge systems.
Absolutely. I think you mentioned a very important point, which is that of what we call as bhav anuvad instead of just the shabd anuvad, which is that the import or the emotion or the sentiment of what has been said, has to be looked at. Of course, the commentaries like that of Max Muller, for instance, when it comes to the Vedic corpus, is very, very skewed and not the best of sources for that. So when we talk about context, education was never undertaken in isolation in the Gurukul system. It was highly contextualized and even supported by the community, for that matter. Contributions towards education were considered the highest form of donation. All members of the society contributed in some form or the other. For instance, the Agrahara system in South India often comprised of a whole settlement of learned Brahmin scholars with their own relative degree of power of government, and was maintained by generous donations from society. So in today's educational landscape, we see the rise of private educational institutions, but they're not quite the community-powered autonomous centers of learning we had previously. So what all can we learn from the past when it comes to autonomy and freedom of centers of learning from the influence of state power, money, as well as other factors?
Yeah, that is a very involved and I guess a complicated problem. So yes, this is very true. So first of all, to talk about the traditional system, where this whole network of institutions, right, at various levels, was supported typically by the community that was always there, plus the government. That is for instance, if you had a local chieftain, they might support the schools. They might give land for these schools in their domain. The kings supported them. So for instance, large universities, of course, they needed a very large amount of formal support, and that came from the government. It also came from rich members of society who were able to support them. Now, any society has to invest in the education of its next generation. This is simply something that one cannot rely on some other entity. I mean, even though a government belongs to the community, a government is still not exactly the community. So you cannot rely on them entirely, because then what happens is you lose control over that kind of education that's imparted. The community is the stakeholder, so it needs to really invest and work with them. Now, this is where traditionally the whole idea of donating for Vidya, and that often translated to donating, as you mentioned, agrahars were where the most learned people lived. So therefore, it was considered a very good thing to do to donate to these people, because these people in return gave to the community. They dedicated their lives to learning and teaching, right? But that is now, unfortunately been given a bad name, that, these people were just living off society without doing much. And I don't think that is true. Always, the community sustained teachers, and teachers at all levels. And that is essential to keep the learning beneficial for society. Now, how do we, in today's world, deal with this? So again, I think there needs to be, a multi-pronged kind of support. The government does support institutions, but the government has its own compulsions, has its own needs and priorities. So it's very essential for the community to also support schools. Otherwise, basically, education gets, our traditional belief is that Vidya is always to be given for free, right? Vidya cannot be sold, right? What does that mean? So in today's world, we do need to sustain an educational institution. So it wouldn't be practicable to say there'll be no fees. Although you can, you still have examples of where this is almost true. So, for instance, you have I studied in the Kendriya Vidyalaya system. My education was almost free, right? We've paid a very nominal fee, but it was almost free. So there are, even today, there are examples of that where people pay a very nominal sum. But for instance, in Agastya Gurukul, we are not able to run it unless we actually have, we request donations from parents. So this has to be, made sustainable. So yes, I understand we need that. But at the same time, when there are students who are unable to afford to pay our fees, we never say no to them. We will always, accept them as long as they're really interested in this kind of learning, and we find other sources to support them. So this is really what we need. We need to have the ability to accommodate everyone, because Vidya, is not something you can make a profit of. So the minute it goes into the hands of people who are looking to make a profit out of it, you're going to get an inferior product, or you're going to get a tainted product where they're going to feed a certain ideology to your children, which later on will cause a lot of damage to society. So we really need to keep this driven by society. And again, for organizations like Agastya, this really is a big deal. It's not just the donations. Our parents often volunteer for us. Our parents do a lot to help, fill in a lot of roles informally and help us keep this organization going. So I think that is a given. If you want good education, society has to pitch in fully to support.
Absolutely. I think it's a commendable, and I congratulate you for looking at the access side of education, of course, because there is this ongoing discussion about access and the quality of education and how it is not often kind of balanced, in many different instances. Another aspect of access is, of course, languages. Recently, there was a discussion along the lines of the Bharatiya Vigyan Pranali, which is the Indian science systems, and how they still do not have, sciences available within the Indian regional languages, so to say. And it brings me back to the question also of Sanskrit, of course, which is central to the Bharatiya Gyan Pranali, the Indian knowledge systems. Not only is it the mode of knowledge transmission, but also has within itself fascinating nuances like the encoding of numbers, for instance, within letters and words, an algorithmic approach to representation theory, as well as logical ways of sentence construction. So people in the information dynamics field, for instance, in modern times, are looking at it very closely. So how do you see us, firstly, looking at a vision of Sanskrit-based education, and secondly, to make the access part when it comes to linguistics, more widespread, more out there, essentially?
Yeah, so, Sanskritam, as you said, is a very unique and rich language. So one thing is, if you sort of compare with some of the other languages, generally our Indian languages, most of them have come from Sanskrit, have or they've evolved in parallel or from Sanskritam. So a lot of them share a similar, very scientifically structured, for example, an alphabet, right? The alphabet is structured based on the anatomy of the mouth, the oral cavity, the larynx, the pharynx and larynx. So it's very amazing. So this had to have somebody who was an expert in anatomy, who was also interested in language and linguistics, and created this alphabet. So it's just amazing, right? Because these are two fields that you would think are very different. But you start with, in fact, that's how they're named, right? Each varga is named after the part of your mouth or oral cavity that is used to produce the sound. So you have the dantya, the oshtya, right? The talavya. So all of these are very scientifically structured. So even the alphabet is like that. And if you go further, there is a lot of scientific structure in the vyakarana, in the chandas system, in all of this. And a lot of the modern Indian languages also, if you study them deeply enough, and I say that because unfortunately nowadays a lot of the curricula for Indian languages have been greatly watered down. But if you actually study them classically deeply enough, you do get a lot of the scientific structure. But Sanskrit goes even further. As you talked about, there's a lot of ideas about coding and algorithmic usage, numbers in terms of symbols, in terms of letters. So all this kind of coding and decoding makes it very interesting to study. And children don't even realize this, but they're already starting to think algorithmically. And so when they're formally introduced to coding, they will take to it very easily if they have a strong grasp of these concepts in Sanskritam. So plus, Sanskrit is also very rich from the bhava aspect. So a lot of these things. So even if you look at Bhaskaracharya's Leelavati, right? A problem that is described. So, these are problems that are assigned for the children to read and to solve. But the description of the problem is a beautiful poem, right? There's a tree on which there are so many monkeys, and then one monkey goes here, another does this, half of them do something else. Can you now tell me how many there are left? These are typical problems, but the beautiful way that, and it's all poetic, right? The chandas, the description of the scene around, it's not like there were 10 monkeys on a tree, one jumped off, 5, it's not like that. It's not prosaic. So the beauty brings into everything the aesthetics. And I think that overall really builds a lot into the overall holistic development of a child. I mean, one of the biggest things here is you see people who've achieved so much, right, in this world nowadays, especially in the Western world, but you're seeing this in India too. People who've achieved a lot, if you look at it on paper, have studied, have excelled in their education, may have excelled in a career at various stages, and then you get to know that they're suffering from serious depression, mental health problems, and of course with some of the very famous celebrities we've come across, we get to know this only when they commit suicide, and then we hear about that, right? Very sad, because they had a lot to offer to society, and yet something was lacking. And that is where this the emotional resilience, the EQ, these are also very important. And our modern system fails to deliver on that completely. whereas the traditional system builds a lot of that in. It also emphasizes a lot on community building. That was part of the holistic development. And that is crucial, that's critical. Both to, it's only when you feel a part of a community, first of all, you get this resilience too as part of the community, but also it gives you goals, because you realize that what you want to achieve is not only for yourself. What you want to achieve is for the community. And that is where true happiness lies. So that is what, is a big difference between modern education and our traditional Bharatiya Padhati.
Absolutely. And I think there's also this ongoing question about, you mentioned about the language aspect of education. There, of course, the national education policy brings in the question about languages, regional languages as well in the education system. But there is a larger ecosystem when it comes to, for instance, jobs, when it comes to various other interfacing of students post-education. There is still a preeminence of English in that, for that matter. And of course, till the point that we do not change the larger ecosystem, so to say, to accommodate for the inclusion of some of these elements, it will not be as straightforward to just, have some clauses regarding languages within the school education, but not really have a realistic follow-up, so to say, when it comes to life and, what one does with that education, right? So I would love to know from you how you foresee having a smooth transition from the Gurukul model, from a model of education that looks at Indian languages, Sanskritam, for instance, and going into the larger world that is out there, of course, and the nuances of that, so to say.
Yeah, very true. So I think one of the things that this is part of decolonization is to realize that English has been a useful medium, but it was introduced only for the colonizers' convenience, right? Actually, so let me also, I think this probably should have been mentioned in the previous one where you were talking about access. So Sanskritam, coming back, I just wanted to add, there is this idea that it's a very difficult language. Actually, it is not. It is a language that needs to be taught properly, learned properly. The problem is if you don't hear a language around you, right? If you're not otherwise in contact with it at all, and it's simply in a book that you read and write out of, you're not going to learn any language like that. I mean, imagine if English was like that. If nobody around us spoke English, if the only English we had was a textbook that we were reading and we were trying to answer right, after reading, we're not going to be able to talk like this at all. We're not going to be able to talk at all, right? The reason we speak English or any of the other languages we do is because we use it. And Sanskritam, because it has over time lack of patronage and intentional neglect, has been greatly diminished. So we don't hear very much of it other than some mantras that are chanted. And that is what we need a critical mass to reverse. Once you start hearing Sanskrit around you, it is like any other language. And there is no better proof than our children in Agastya, right? They come in their first or second standard, they don't know any Sanskritam at all, and they start learning. It is amazing. And we have children not only in India, but in the US, right? And so I'm talking of children who could not speak any language other than English. But you give them 1 year, right? And they are understanding Sanskritam. 2 years in our system, they're speaking simple Sanskritam. And then you go forward, they're fluent in it, right? It is children easily pick it up. For even adults, I know so many through Samskrita Bharati organizations like that who have been doing so much Sanskrit prachar among adults as well. We are focused on children, but there are others who work for higher ages, and there are so many people who've learned Sanskrit starting in their 40s and 50s and are now teaching, right? Who've learned very well. So it's perfectly possible even for older people to learn. It is not as tough as it is as people think. it requires, again, what makes it tough is the fact that when you're learning it, you often don't have people around you who are speaking it. And that is what makes it tougher. But if you engage with a group of similar people who are interested, it is eminently possible to become fluent in Sanskrit. So I think when we started Agastya, so our online school started 4 years ago. When we started Agastya, this was a big question. How can children learn? Will they be able to learn in Sanskritam, which is a language which is so difficult? And now you're going to teach them maths and science and this. How are they going to do this? So I think that that doubt has been cleared. We have enough experience now. It's very, very possible to teach and effectively transmit knowledge using Sanskritam. You need, again, we face a paucity of teachers. There are very few people who can teach science as well as know Sanskritam at that level to be able to teach it, science in Sanskritam. So, I mean, those are things that over time, as the number of people knowing Sanskritam builds up, these things are going to ease up. Now, coming to what happens in the outside world, which is still very English-centric, what can we do? Then here, this is very true. Again, all these regulations that are being brought in are very welcome because they're very needed to change this mindset of everything has to be in English. It's very welcome that, several of the exams, competitive, I shouldn't say several, a few are now open in other languages. We should encourage this in all languages, not just Sanskritam. I'm talking of, our other languages as well. These have to be encouraged. And why is that so? So there is, Sankrant Sanuji has done this research where he's shown that children who are taught in the vernacular actually understand concepts very well in India and are perhaps even fare better than their peers who are taught in English. Simply because of the familiarity with the language, they're able to learn concepts much better. So, and the same thing is, a lot of the Nobel Prize winners, the majority of them learned in their own languages. Most other countries use their own languages. It's just, countries, India is one of the, I think, most prominent ones that has tried to switch entirely wholesale into English. And I think we should actually reverse that. So we keep our children not only rooted, but also able to understand concepts better and be, there is also a certain pride in your identity that comes from being a master of your own language. There is nothing wrong in knowing other languages. It's a good thing. But to not know your language is a problem. So you need to know what you consider your language. So I think it's really important to continue with these changes. And again, as I said, as the number of people who stop believing that English is necessary for any progress, that it is the only language of progress, let me put it that way. English is necessary for international communication, yes, but it is not the only language in which one can do science or maths or do things at the local level. So as people come to accept that more and more, then we will start seeing a bigger shift. And I think it's happening, and we need to add to that. There are a few enlightened employers who now care less about your English ability and more about your ability for the job you're doing. So previously, for any job, the better English you spoke, the better you were assumed to be. I don't think that's true of all employers now, and that's a good thing. Over time, these efforts need to be increased. And as the number of people who are schooled in other languages increases, it is going to change. We do need good textbooks, though, in these the other languages. So in Sanskritam, we struggle because there are no extant good textbooks for children in Sanskritam for science, for maths, for history and geography. So these efforts will have to be made. We have a few, one or two organizations working on this, and this needs to be further.
Right. So I think there is an important aspect with regards to science and technology, of course, and there is an ongoing discussion about how scientific research and research in general can also be presented within Sanskritam, for instance, and various other Indian languages, because that leads to a certain continuity in higher education, so to say, when it comes to the mode of transmission. Now, in Agastya Gurukulam, it's a very interesting case study because you have looked at the hybridization of the Gurukulam model, also incorporating modern subjects and work with the positives of both the Gurukulam model as well as contemporary educational frameworks. This is very important given the ever-evolving and fast-paced knowledge generation and application that we see in today's world. When I conceptualize a Gurukul model, education, it is not as just about being in the traditional thing of the Gurukul or teaching traditional Bharatiya themes alone. It also involves the critical thinking, experiential learning, and comprehensive education. So how can we attain a balance between the indigenous extant model of Bharat in the Gurukulam model and the contemporary pedagogy as seen in today's world for a rooted and yet relevant model of teaching and learning?
Yeah, this has been entirely the endeavor with Agastya that, since we have been in existence. So the first thing is, as I mentioned, we started as an online Gurukulam, and we started during the pandemic. So, that was it, everything was online anyways at that time. In the last year, we actually started physical Gurukulams, both in Bangalore and in Houston. So in all of the online as well as the Bangalore curriculum, all the education is in the medium of Sanskrit language, right? So we're teaching everything via Sanskritam. Children also learn, in addition to Sanskritam, they all also learn one Indian language, additional Indian language. Usually it's the mother tongue. And they also all learn English. That is compulsory. Given the modern day world that they will need to go into. So that is how it works for the online and the Bangalore Gurukulam. Houston Gurukulam, because of the different needs, we have had to make a slight change to this. So here, science and maths are taught in English. So science and maths are in English. The rest of them are the same. They still have to learn two Bharatiya languages and English. One of the Bharatiya languages, Sanskritam. And then they learn Itihas and Bhugol is still taught in Sanskritam. So this is roughly, how we do the language part. And then we have found that online learning works, okay? So children do learn online. At the younger ages, it's harder. So in your grade, in the first and second standards, for instance, it's hard for children to sit for prolonged periods of time online. But with parents being involved and being around, sitting with them in many cases, it is possible to do. With the older children, they're a little better at sitting, and the older they get, the better they are. But also, the older they get, they also tend to get distracted by opening up other web pages. So they'll be logged in, but they're looking at a different tab or a different window and doing something else. So this is always a big challenge, this distraction. So the ideal thing would be in-person schooling, which we are trying a couple of places. But since there are a lot of parents, a lot of children in places that we don't have physical Gurukulams and who still want this education, the online model still works, but that's not enough. So how do we supplement it? So first of all, in a Gurukulam, it's not just about the time you're learning. It's about what you do all through the day. What you do when you wake up, the dinacharya you follow, the principles you're following in what you're doing, how you eat, a lot of things. So for all of this, we rely in the online version and also in our day schools, because once they go home, they're only with their parents. We rely on the parents to provide that sort of a Gurukul framework and to follow the principles that we recommend should be followed at home. For instance, we recommend that they do not see much TV at all, right? And any movies or any such entertainment that they do watch, that it should be holistic and, uh, you know, should not be teaching them wrong values. So, it's left to parents' discretion, but this is what we strongly advise. And a lot of our kids are in homes where sometimes there is no TV, or the TV is, turned on for maybe half an hour a day or a week, something like that. So it's a very different kind of, we want that atmosphere, the Gurukul atmosphere, and the parents do work with us to do that. So that is one thing about the online system. But even that is not enough. You want to have the, as you said, the experiential learning, and also the bonding with your acharyas. So that's what our children call their teachers, their acharyas. So you want the bonding with the acharyas, and you want the bonding with their guru bandhus, that is their classmates and friends. So for this, we hold at least once a year, but often twice a year, camps, physical camps at specific locations, where often the family will come with the child too. So we have children, the teachers, the acharyas, as well as families. They spend time. So for instance, we had a camp at Puri in Orissa. This was last summer. We had the camp there. So children, and we make a camp theme which is relevant to the place we are at. So for instance, this one of the big themes was the Shilp Shastra, the different styles of architecture, because there were a variety of temples, Konark and in Bhubaneswar, and they went to these different temples, learned first, they had classes from an expert on the different styles of architecture. And then they went and looked at these temples, which were examples of this architecture and how it had evolved. So, the very smallest one to the very elaborate, large temples, how that pans out. So this is an example. So during that time, children, live together, eat together, study together, play together, bond with their acharyas, with each other. Families get to network with each other. Often our families are constantly bombarded by the larger family about how can you do this to your child, right? You have put them into this kind of a retrogressive education system where they're teaching them Sanskritam. Apne kya pandit banana chahte ho kya? This is the kind of thing that they're getting to hear all the time. And I think we should give our children the choice. If they want to be a pandit, they should have the choice to do that. And if they want to be, an aerospace engineer, they should have the choice to do that. So this is what we want for them, the choice to decide what they want to do and do it. So again, coming back, it gives families the opportunity to network with each other and to have a support system which helps them support the Gurukulam, but also helps them also be clearer in their goals and vision for their child. So these camps are really integral parts of what we do. Another camp we had last year was a camp at an Ayurveda ashram in Palakkad in Kerala. So the theme of the camp was Ayurveda. So our children were there. They had lectures about Ayurveda. They then actually experienced some of the, the massage technique. They learned how to do that for themselves. And then they saw how others were were told how others were being treated. And, there were people around who were being treated. They got to see a factory of Ayurvedic medicines, how those are made. So it was an immersive learning experience for them about Ayurveda. So these are the kinds of experiences we try to create for our students. And that supplements the online learning experience where it's more theoretical. They do try sometimes to show, for instance, science experiments online too. But yeah, this is how we put it together. Of course, in our direct online, not online, direct in-person schools as well, those children also have the option of attending our camps for getting the enrichment learning. So that's how we combine the two and try to create a as close to a Gurukulam as possible.
Absolutely. I think that brings us to the point about e-Gurukuls, and which we had a discussion previously about how e-Gurukuls can be effective. So you have beautifully highlighted that there is, of course, a human element, the element of society, of course, the element of how you integrate your existence with society around, as well as with nature, for instance. And you highlighted this point about values, right? I mean, in the Gurukul system, the learning was premised on values. So, for instance, the Guru Dakshina was to show gratitude for the wisdom received from the Guru. There are anecdotes of how the Guru would instill independence, courage, team spirit, honesty, and integrity within students through exercises and tests. In today's age, when one sees a dearth of values at various points, and even humanism, so to say, you have spoken about the emotional quotient. There's a certain vacuity of sorts of values of this purpose, so to say, right? And yet I believe that in Agastya Gurukulam, you do not quite teach religion, but you have a more value-based kind of perspective, of course. So how do you see our education policy deriving from the ancient Bharatiya frameworks when it comes to a more humanistic and values-based education?
Yeah, as I was saying, I think the values are actually the most important part of the education. And I think that is kind of very apparent from what you can see. We've had extremely well-educated leaders in India who have not achieved that much. And we have leaders who have not been that educated, who have done so much for the country, right? We have all seen this. It really doesn't depend on how much they're educated in the modern sense. It is really the values, the motivation that is critical. And that is something we cannot, values cannot be taught through a textbook, right? You cannot say, be honest and expect that the child is going to be honest. This has to be learned experientially. It has to be modeled, right? And this is why an acharya is called an acharya, because they teach you how you should live, what you should do. So, a lot of this, again, as I'm telling you, in the online system, as well as with our, to a lesser extent, with our in-person Gurukuls, these need to be supplemented by the parents pitching in to model a lot of these values. But being with Agastya also helps parents sometimes to reflect and to also bring in these changes. It's not that we intend to live in a way that doesn't align with certain values. In many cases, it's habit. We're used to doing things a certain way, and then we question, something leads us to question whether that's the right thing to do. Just to give you an example, so we have, let's say water conservation. When water was not scarce, people were used to using it very liberally, right? You turn on, it was very common, and even today is common. You turn on the tap and you're brushing, and while you're brushing, the tap just flows, right? And we don't think of this necessarily until it's brought to us. We didn't intend to waste water. We just didn't think that it was so important. Maybe we didn't realize how much water gets wasted in that much time. So these are this was just a little example. I'm just quoting to tell you about how we mean to do well, but sometimes we don't recognize what we are doing not quite so well in our lives. So being among a community of such people actually helps people kind of recognize these things and implement and realize that it's practical to implement in your own life. So for instance, after our camp, right, where we've had, certain people who are very concerned. So some parents who are very much into eating sattvic food and eating also healthy food, so they have influenced the food served in the during a camp, for instance, which other parents then realized, oh, this food tasted really good, even though we didn't have certain things in as much of proportion as we are used to. And then they're asking for recipes, they're exchanging recipes, they're going home, trying these things out. So we've seen a lot of these kinds of changes. So now more people are eating more healthy, they're avoiding, fried stuff and things like that. So this is one example of how you spread good values. But again, there is also another example. We're an online school, right? How do you conduct tests? We send them the question paper at the time of the test. The parent prints it out and gives it to the children. Now the child sits in front of a screen and takes the exam, but not necessarily always. So sometimes if a child misses a test, they're trying to do a makeup. We don't always have an invigilator sitting and watching them while they're writing it. If the parent says they will watch them. So there is an honor system here. We go by that. We believe that you will take it right. And that is a very important thing for the child to know they are being trusted and that they need to do the right thing. Because at this age, right, at that stage of life, the marks are not what matters, right? The more important thing is learning to resist that temptation to pick up your textbook or notebook, which is just at arm's reach, because you're sitting at your table, everything is right there. But to resist that temptation and to write it honestly, right? But this is something that develops over time. And our children, our parents, and same thing with the parents, right? What are you going to do with those marks in your third standard or your fifth standard? The more important thing is for your third grader and fifth grader to learn how to have integrity, how to be honest. So otherwise, there's no point putting them in the Gurukulam, right? So we work with this. And I think that is also a practical learning where you learn to be responsible, you learn to be truthful and to do your dharma. The most, one of the key values that needs to be transmitted is you have to do your dharma. You have to recognize what your dharma is and follow it, irrespective of whatever else you're tempted by. So that really is the essence of all the values, right? It is the dharma that you need to follow. And yes, although I use the word dharma because I don't have another word in English that will describe this. But we do not say, we're not catering this is a Hindu school. No, this is a Bharatiya knowledge systems based, Bharatiya culture based, Bharatiya languages based school. And an integral part of these knowledge systems are certain values, certain philosophical beliefs and values. And that is part and parcel of what is taught.
Absolutely. I think it's been a really fascinating discussion. You just mentioned about the values, of course, and one point that obviously comes to the fore is the decentralized mode of education, that every individual student is said to be the carrier of the wisdom of the the various values, integrity, honesty, and so on. I think now in today's world there is a certain artifice of sorts. There are actually many artifices of how we not quite impose, but we dictate to students about the various aspects they should be undertaking or having in themselves, but not necessarily inculcating it in them in an organic manner, so to say. And it's very encouraging to see that that is not the case with Agastya Gurukulam and your vision as well. So Archana ji, any parting words for our viewers today?
I would encourage parents of young children to really look into what their school is teaching their child and what the world around them is teaching.
Right.
Because we often we know that this school is considered very good. Children who come from there go to top universities, and that is what we base our decisions on putting our child into that school. But I think it's really important to look deeper into what values you want your child to learn. It doesn't have to be the most popular school that teaches them the best values. look at what you have available to you. Nowadays, there are a lot of online options too. So look at them. There are other organizations like Agastya. Look at all of them. See what fits you. And most importantly, in education, let's not be driven by what the Joneses did, right? Because my neighbor sends them there doesn't mean that's the best school for my child. Think of these things. Look deeper. There are lots of unwanted ideologies that are woven into the syllabus. Unless you take a magnifying glass and look at it carefully, we don't pick that up at first go. And there is a lot of this happening in today's world, very unfortunately. So please be aware of this. Be careful. There have been very good talks by Vijaya Vishwanathanji, who's my co-founder, on some of these dangers that lurk in school curricula nowadays. A lot in the West, but it's also creeping into the same in the Indian education system. We are seeing that. So it's really important to look at these things. Facts, anyone will learn. Nobody, I tell parents who are anxious, nobody, finishes schooling without learning to do addition, subtraction, multiplication, solving basic equations. Everybody learns that. These are basics, and that is not really the challenge. Maybe one child learns it 1 year earlier than the other, but I don't think that really matters in the long run. What matters eventually is that they have a good sense of themselves, they have a good sense of vision of where they want to go, and that they have the resilience to follow that path. All of us along this path will fall many times, and we should have the resilience to get up and keep going forward.
Absolutely. I think the whole idea of the contextual education and how we make independent citizens and thinkers more than people who are excelling within some parameters, within some frameworks, essentially is the need of the hour. And I think the contemporary pedagogical practices or innovations are looking at that. All we need to look at times is to look at the extant heritage that we already have within Bharat, especially the Gurukulam system. I would like to again commend and congratulate you for the work with Agastya Gurukulam, and I would like to thank you for joining us today for this rather fascinating discussion. Thank you, Archana ji.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
We look forward to you all viewers joining us in the next episode of Satya Samvad. Namaskar.